On the 26th of January, 1885, 2 days before his 52nd birthday, on some steps at the governor's palace in Khartoum, Charles George Gordon, Major General in the British Army, Governor General of the Sudan by commission of the Turkish ruler of Egypt, the Khedive, met his death in the morning at the hands of soldiers in the army of the Islamic revolutionary Mohammed Ahmed ibn Abdallah, the Mahdi. According to the usually accepted account, one of the rebels on the staircase, a man from Dongola named Taha Shahin, shouted, "O cursed one, your time has come," and plunged his spear into Gordon's chest. Gordon, with a gentle gesture of disdain, it was thought in England, reeled at the blow, turned, and was struck by more spears flung at him from below. That may not be how he died at all. Many things in the life of Gordon, even the manner of his death, are contradictory and unsure. But if he left behind him unanswered questions, he also left an imperishable name. Gordon of Khartoum, like Clive of India or Lawrence of Arabia. But what sort of man was he?
Martyr? Misfit? Hero? Charlatan? Saint? Religious maniac? Mystic? Mountebank? Brandy toper? Opium addict? Or true Christian knight? He's been called all of these. In the great days of the British Empire, there were many fine soldiers or colonial administrators, men of high ideals, sometimes of eccentric individuality, often of noble achievement, whose tombs are to be found scattered among the cemeteries of old empire territories, or whose epitaphs in country churches or cathedrals evoke an almost medieval chivalry. Now, in that sense, Gordon had no tomb. A cenotaph in St. Paul's Cathedral, it's true. But the man himself was lost to view, swallowed by the sands of the desert. His body was never found, there was no grave, there is no corner of a foreign field. And in that sense, too, Gordon had no epitaph, except perhaps for these two sentences of his own. One in the last dispatch that got out of beleaguered Khartoum, at the end of which he wrote, "I have done my best for the honor of our country. Goodbye." And it has with it a typically baffling postscript. "You send me no information, though you have lots of money." And the other, in a farewell letter to his sister Augusta, "I am quite happy, thank God, and I have tried to do my duty." In his life, Gordon persistently seemed to elude the efforts of those who would comprehend him. And then he disappeared. Can we possibly, nearly 100 years later, get close to this extraordinary man?
Some things are certain. In his death, Gordon became the hero of Victorian England. Books in his praise blossomed and flourished. Not for 2 generations did anyone dare question his glorious reputation. Memorial poems, odes, elegies flowed from profuse and eloquent pens, and not only in English. Souvenirs and bric-a-brac of all kinds catered to the cult, almost rivaling the royal family. Stained glass windows were designed to celebrate him. He was honored with an effigy in St. Paul's Cathedral. He was given a statue in Trafalgar Square, reserved only for heroes of the highest order. Later, as the glory faded a little, it was removed to less august accommodation several hundred yards away along the Thames embankment, complete with its somber inscription. This was the most notable statue of all, in Khartoum itself. Certainly in the earlier decades of this century, no imperial celebration was conceivable in the Sudan without a ritual parade at the shrine of the man who had died here so splendidly, and so entirely to the approval of the British public. But the world changed, and a newly independent Sudan rejected the memory of Gordon. Where the statue stood, this sculpture now stands, symbol of a young republic striving for unity, seeking native heroes. A flag Gordon would not recognize now flies over the palace where he died, which itself has been altered over the years. Now it is the People's Palace, official residence of His Excellency, the President of the Sudan. But echoes remain, and there is still an outer staircase that now sweeps more grandly down, a few feet from where Gordon fell. And the statue has survived, and looks out not over Khartoum streets and desert sands, but the playing fields of Britain's national and perpetual memorial to Charles George Gordon, the Gordon Boys' School, near Woking, Surrey, England. Every Sunday, the boys parade in the Gordon tartan, and the names of 4 of the key places in Gordon's life are perpetuated in the names of the school houses. There could be no more appropriate memorial to one who, when not engaged in distant battles in unfamiliar lands, devoted years of his life and a great deal of his money to the welfare of boys less fortunate than himself. Also every Sunday in the chapel, the school recalls the character and the mission of its fallen patron, celebrating both with hymns he particularly liked and prayers he could not have known.
Let us join together and say the Gordon Boys' School prayer. O God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for General Gordon, for his courage and his faith, for his devotion to the sick and needy, and especially the boys. We thank you for this school dedicated to his memory, and grant that all of us, like your servant, General Gordon, may always be loyal soldiers of the King of Kings, your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
And within earshot of the chapel, there is a place where the memory of this remarkable Victorian is more practically preserved, the school museum. Here there is a corner that is forever Gordon, where there is a collection of remainders from his life, many of them objects of great rarity and value, given to him by foreign potentates and governments, but also many of them very homely, ordinary things, things such as he himself used to call his rubbish, which were packed and unpacked meticulously as he came and went. Objects which may help us to catch his spirit on the wing, perhaps. A signet ring. Not the one he wore in Khartoum, but one he wore on earlier journeys. It bears in Greek and in reverse, so that he could stamp its message in wax to be read by his correspondents. Hoteos metasu, God with you. A leather-headed walking cane, which must often have accompanied his swift, tripping, forward-leaning gait. One of his Bibles, which bears on the flyleaf the date 1883. This was sent to him while he was in Jerusalem. And he wrote back, the Bible came out in capital order, it's a beauty, and its leather scents the whole room. Also on the flyleaf, there's a reference, Psalm 91. Turn to Psalm 91, and you read, I think this is very Gordon. He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him will I trust. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. Gordon himself was no docile child of tradition and discipline. His father described life with young Charlie as sitting on a powder keg. He was tough, inventive, and rebellious. He was born in Woolwich on the 28th of January, 1833, the fourth son of 11 children to Elizabeth, wife of Henry William Gordon, Royal Artillery, later Lieutenant General. The house, number 1 Kemp Terrace, was dangerously not a stone's throw away from the Royal Military Academy. this institution known as the Shop trained officer cadets for the Royal Artillery and the Royal Engineers, and it was to play a large part in Gordon's life for almost 2 decades. To begin with, it was a marvelous target for youthful attacks, sometimes violent, sometimes furtive. A disruptive campaign against the commandant's house, for example, introducing vermin, mice, which had been collected with attentive care from the Gordon household. This and other similar exploits, including an assault on government property windows with a specially made crossbow, caused no small scandal. But nothing seems to have affected the fixed determination of the culprit to become one of the official members of the Academy when he reached the appropriate age. He seemed to have no thoughts for anything but a military career.
Like many soldiers' families, the Gordons followed the drum. Wherever father was posted, the rest trooped after to Dublin, Leith, Corfu. And it was in Corfu that young Charlie, aged 9 and quite unable to swim, developed the disconcerting habit of chucking himself off high rocks into very deep water, where, of course, he had to be rescued. Now, this action certainly did draw attention to himself, and it suggests possibly a preoccupation with danger for its own sake. But he was doing this before the traumatic experience that some say brought about in him a death wish that lasted all his life. Some say.
This experience occurred when, back in England, he was sent to a school at Taunton, where apparently he shone only at meticulous map-making. Here something happened. Years later, he wrote of this time to a friend, "I remember a deep bitterness then, never can forget it, though I was only 10 or 12 years old. Humanly speaking, it changed my life." Tough and aggressive as he was sensitive to some dark experience that put a permanent mark on him. What it was that he looked back on with such emotion, that so haunted his memory, we do not know. Some act of schoolboy violence that got out of hand, perhaps? Some moment of pain, or cruelty, or terror? He wrote, "I never had a sorrow like it in all my life. Therefore I love children very much," which suggests that he was a witness to or the victim of cruelty. He also wrote, "I wished I was a eunuch at 14, which alludes perhaps to desires on his part that appalled him. Most have assumed that he had some kind of homosexual experience that scarred his soul. Whatever it was, it seems to have led to the repression of sexual desires for the rest of his life."
By the right! Quick, march!
But his thirst for military glory was unchanged. At 15, he was back in Woolwich, a cadet at the Royal Military Academy. It was a tough world with precise codes of conduct and a long-standing tradition of bullying and the roughing up of civilians. Gordon responded to or against all this with his own aggression. However, he impressed his superiors with his field sketching and his studies in fortifications and siege work. Also notable was his fiery temper, his slight self-control, his quick sense of injustice, his sudden reactions to the strong disciplines of young military life. He was distinctly insubordinate. On one occasion, a cadet corporal, for some reason, ordered cadets not to leave the dining hall at a moment when Gordon plainly wanted to do so.
He compounded the felony by losing his temper with the junior cadet and hitting him over the head with a hairbrush, and by being found out. The penalty was 6 months' loss of seniority, which also meant that he lost all chance of keeping abreast of his contemporaries in the Royal Artillery. So, greatly disappointing his father, but perhaps more appropriately to his own particular talents, he joined the Royal Engineers and was commissioned. Charlie was 19.
He was slightly below average height. He had light brown curly hair, slight side whiskers, a small curly moustache. Some pictures suggest an almost feminine delicacy, others a toughness, but always a penetrating gaze. The eyes were light blue and colorblind, and they nearly always made some sort of deep impression on those who encountered them, some of whom spoke of it. "Gordon's eyes looked you through and through," said one, And another, his clear blue eyes seemed to possess magic power. A third declared he could see through a millstone. And another, his full, clear and bright blue eyes seemed to court something, while at the same time they searched into your inner soul. His voice was normally quiet, even gentle, but when roused it would rise in pitch and volume and speed. He sometimes himself allowed he was very, very bad-tempered, but his outbursts of fury were usually quickly over. Commissioned and ready for martial glory, he was not pleased to be sent to Pembrokeshire to assist in the construction of coastal forts. He thought it a complete waste of time and effort. Indeed, he was to be dogged by useless forts. For consolation, he shot game, and inspired by a certain fellow captain, he found religion. Gordon now began a lifelong study of the Bible and began to develop a close, devoted, unorthodox, and comradely relationship with his own very personal God. Perhaps with relief, he began to think of the body as only a tabernacle, the tabby, he often called it, the unworthy vessel of the immortal soul within. He adopted other lifelong habits as salves to his unquiet mind, smoking and letter writing, at this time mostly about his newfound faith, to his sister, for example. "My dear Augusta, thank God it is different with me now. I feel much happier and more contented than I used to." In 1854, Britain went to war in the Crimea. Gordon had just come of age. From Corfu, where he found himself a second time, he pleaded for a reposting. Once in the Crimea, he exhibited his old map-making skills, his disregard of danger, his urgent love of action, and all the hallmarks of a thoroughly promising young officer. When the war in the Crimea was over, and the British abandoned their cantonments in Balaclava and the hospital at Scutari,
Gordon emerged from the campaign with one slight wound, a reputation as a fine surveyor, the approval of his superiors, the friendship of Garnet Wolseley, among others, and every prospect of a highly successful career. And as a man whose volcanic outbursts in the face of dishonesty or laziness were to be feared. He himself said of his temper in general that it was typical of the Gordon tribe, and he was very proud of being a Gordon. But at the same time, he was high-spirited and cheerful. No great wit, perhaps, but full of jokes. A very short time after he was wounded, he made great play of trying to light his cigar at the red head of the examining surgeon. And he'd not yet developed his horror of parties, dinners, and the social round.
His next stride forward was in China, where he applied for a posting in 1860. He was 27 and lusting for action after several more wasted years. The pretext for action was the suppression of a rebellion which it was in the interests of the European powers to help the Chinese imperial power to put down. It was called the Taiping Rebellion, and it spread across China like a cancer, claiming not merely thousands but millions of lives by battle, siege, starvation, and disease. Gordon found himself in action first with a British contingent, but soon as the commander of a Chinese guerrilla force which bore the boastful title, the Ever-Victorious Army. Under Gordon's unorthodox and inventive leadership, the title began to be deserved. These are some of the men who formed his personal bodyguard. With this army, he attacked and took many cities, always sharing with his men the dangers and discomforts of the campaign. He won the fervent admiration of his Chinese employers.
Li Hongchang, the provincial governor and Gordon's generalissimo, a man who really distrusted all foreigners and thought foreigners basically the cause of the rebellion, said of Gordon, "What a sight it is for tired eyes, what an elixir for a weary heart, to watch this Englishman fight. Fight, fight again, move again, planning by night, executing by day, planning by day, executing by night. He is a glorious fellow." Time and time again, in the most dangerous situations, without the lightest regard for his personal safety, Gordon led his troops into action, into the attack on city after city, wielding nothing more deadly than a little light cane. This is actually one that he carried in China with an empty cartridge case on the end. And he developed a habit, if he saw a reluctant officer in the attack, of taking him gently by the arm and encouraging him forward into the breeze.
The rebellion ended in 1864. It had lasted in all for 14 years. In those years, more lives were lost than in the whole of the First World War.
Among the dead, after Gordon's capture of Soochow, was one of the rebel leaders, or Wangs, one La Wang, who had surrendered with others, and at Gordon's great insistence had been promised a pardon. But Yi Hung Chang, who had so much praise for Gordon as a fighter, went back on his word and had La Wang and his companions beheaded. And when Gordon came across the results of this massacre, heads lying beside bodies that had been split up the middle, he was overcome with rage and shame, and he went in search of the military governor. Perhaps fortunately he couldn't find him, but instead he left a letter threatening to give all the cities he had taken back to the rebels. Now, the next morning, a British military surgeon who was with the expedition, Halliday McCartney, went to visit Gordon in his room, and he found him sitting on his bed in tears. And then Gordon reached under the bed and brought out an object wrapped in a silk scarf. "Do you see this?" he said, sobbing. "It is the head of La Wang, foully murdered." And then, according to McCartney, he became too hysterical to be reasoned with. Certain pressures, certain cruelties, certain acts that Gordon considered treacherous could reduce him to incoherence, but calmer thoughts would follow, and in this case, accompanied by a rational explanation of his rage. "If faith had been kept," he said, "then there would have been no more fighting. Every town would have given in. All my work has been thrown away." But in fact, the end of the rebellion was not far off. And for Gordon, there was great honor and praise and many rich gifts.
Particularly this one, the yellow jacket, granted by the emperor to only 50 mandarins in the whole Chinese empire. This portrait of him wearing it was painted after his return to England in 1865. All this helped to make him a British national hero. From now on, for the next 20 years, he would be known to an admiring press and public as Chinese Gordon. He had won his first glory as the servant of a foreign power in distant lands. At home, he faced familiar disappointment.
What happened to him? Those footling forts again. 6 months after his leave began, and long before it should have expired, Gordon requested to go back to duty. He was given command of the Royal Engineers at Gravesend to supervise the reconstruction of certain ancient forts guarding the Thames estuary. This one, for example.
Sean Mead Fort, on the southern shore of the Thames. East Tilbury Fort, on the northern shore. It's not hard to imagine the frustration of this energetic, impatient, but very professional officer as he went his endless rounds. Every day he sped about his business he felt was mostly pointless, at a run rather than a walk, with complete attention to detail from 8 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon.
If he found any work behindhand, he would upbraid the culprits in his highly personal fashion. "Another 5 minutes gone and this not done yet, my men. We shall never have those 5 minutes again."
His speed was a byword. As he dashed about his forts, he would be followed at an ever-increasing distance by a trail of scurrying subalterns. Outstripping his followers was a habit with him all his life, whether on foot or riding, or in the action of his mind, and whether right or wrong. There was another fort where he lived, Gravesend, a sort of grave for him too. And yet this small port on the teeming London River has never forgotten Gordon. He stayed here for 6 years. With no military heights to aspire to, he channeled his immense energy into helping the unfortunate. And it is in this guise that the memory of the eccentric colonel lives here still. In particular, he gave free rein to his fervent and creative affection for boys, homeless boys, Dickensian boys, the Oliver Twists and Artful Dodgers of this part of England. He set up a little school in his house and gave them a rudimentary education, doing everything he could to improve their minds, but more important still, to save their souls. He taught them and found them jobs and welcomed them when they came back to see him. His kings, he called them. Great blessings in Perry Street. Got 3 rough lads into a room and found they were kings. Was there sublimated homosexuality in all this? Perhaps. But there's no doubt that faith and discipline had eliminated the furtive, leaving only open and affectionate generosity.
He lived in Fort House that stood here in its own grounds, which are now the Gordon Memorial Gardens. The house itself was totally destroyed by a direct hit from a V2 in the last war, but the gardens, which Gordon set aside for the poor of Gravesend to enjoy and to grow the vegetables that they couldn't afford, the gardens remain for the people of Gravesend. He'd have approved of that.
His religiosity at times took amazing turns, inspired no doubt by the parable of the sower. He was frequently to be seen out of uniform, distributing religious tracts, sometimes in highly original ways.
But unregenerate pride was not quite dead. His good friends, the worthy Mr. and Mrs. Freeze of the Religious Tract Society of Gravesend, who must incidentally have been extremely useful to him, took some time to equate the Colonel with Chinese Gordon. One day the conversation turned to China, and Mrs. Freeze asked him, "Were you ever there?" "Indeed I was." "Then did you see anything of the Taiping Rebellion?" "I should think I did." "Why, it was I who put an end to it."
When not in Gravesend, Gordon was usually to be found in Southampton, then a pleasant, modish watering place and seaport, not yet thronged with industry and ocean liners. His father and sister had settled there and found a house suitable to their means, not in the new grand parade known as Carlton Crescent, with its balconied bow windows and stable yards where the carriage wheels flashed, but in the less assuming Rockstone Place nearby. No carriage, hansom cabs to the station if required, and it was not at first purchased but leased from the spinster daughters of a retired ironmonger. This house in 1873 Gordon bought for Augusta for £900. It's intriguing to speculate that if only he'd accepted the tens of thousands of pounds that he was offered time and time again, rather than insisting on a mere 1,000 or 2 instead, he could have bought Augusta a much grander villa round the corner. But then Augusta, I'm sure, would have agreed that humility was much nobler than ostentation, and in any case that greed was a vice to be avoided at all costs. Neither Charlie nor she were of Cecil Rhodes's mind, who, when he met Gordon in the Cape, said quite frankly that if he'd been in Gordon's position in China, he'd have made himself emperor. Not an emperor, but a humble servant of the crown, he now found himself dispatched to the region of the lower Danube, as a member of a commission resolving boundary problems resulting from the Crimean War. In course of time, he arrived in Constantinople, capital of the Turkish Empire, of which at that time Egypt and the Sudan were dependencies. Here he met the Armenian Prime Minister of Egypt, who saw him as a likely candidate for a post of some importance about to become vacant in the southern Sudan. The post was that of governor of Equatoria, and the man who had the gift of that office was the ruler of Egypt on behalf of Turkey, the Khedive Ismail. The offer, approved by Britain, was accepted by Gordon, and Ismail commissioned him to go to the Sudan. Arrived in Cairo, which called itself the Paris of the Levant, and which he didn't like, he wrote to Augusta that Ismail thought he had a rash fellow to deal with who could be persuaded to cut a dash, and found he had one of the Gordon race. He set off up the Nile, having accepted only a fifth of the salary offered him, and more folk in authority began to believe that Chinese Gordon was off his head. But he was embarked, for better or worse, on a preoccupation with this part of Africa which would involve him for over 10 years. It was 1874, he was 41, and he had just over 10 years to live. He came for the first time to Khartoum by boat.
His arrival was typically Gordon. Behind him was a 2-hour run in a grand special train which came off the rails, followed by a much longer journey in an ordinary and very full train. Begun in glory and ended in shame, said Gordon. Then there was a 260-mile, 9-day camel ride across the desert, followed by 4 days in a Nile steamer, during which His Excellency helped to haul the boat through the rapids, trouserless among the crocodiles. Arrived in Khartoum, he was given a public and military reception, followed by a more private banquet complete with near-naked dancing girls, all for His Excellency's delight. But not long into this entertainment, it was abruptly noticed that His Excellency had removed himself. During the preparations for a return banquet, Gordon rolled up his sleeves and had already filled 40 specially bought bowls with tapioca pudding. When he was persuaded to leave the rest of the arrangements to his chief of staff.
Accompanied by a multinational entourage of lieutenants and servants, and believing himself the leader of a crusade, he headed south for Equatoria. The Sudan is the largest country in Africa, and Equatoria was the Sudan's southernmost and most dangerous province, racked with pestilence, disease, tribal rivalries, and the slave trade, which it was Gordon's explicit instruction to abolish.
As the journey progressed and the difficulties mounted, Gordon began to form harder opinions of his associates than he'd had at the beginning. His German valet he now threatened to kill if he continued to call him Your Excellency. His lieutenant, Chaye Long, a curious mustachioed American from the deep south who'd earned Gordon's approval to start with, was now found to be utterly useless. He's always going to do something or other, but he never ever does it. Gordon struck the steamer captain. He called his ADC a baboon and a booby. In fact, his whole staff was limp, all flourish and no result. But these moods passed quickly, and on one occasion he said contritely to Chaye Long, "I've been very low, old fellow. Don't be hard on me, but this is a terrible country." Gordon had not been long in the Sudan before he discovered that the abolition of slavery was a far more difficult proposition than he'd hoped. His brief from the governments both at home and in Cairo was to abolish it, but he soon found that the ideal and what could actually be achieved are two very different matters. The Anti-Slavery Society had persuaded the Khedive to close the Nile to slavers, but this meant that the slaves still had to make their terrible journey on foot. Gordon wrote to the secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society, "I am sure a poor child walking across these burning plains would say, 'Oh, I do wish these gentlemen had left us alone to come down by boat.'"
He did his best, but to the horror of many in England, he admitted that abolition would only come by slow steps. "When the trees obey me," he wrote, "then will the tribes liberate their slaves." Rain, heat, malaria are all round him. Misery and mist, mosquitoes, snakes, rats, ants, scorpions, flies, native drums through the nights.
Gordon drank boiled water mixed with a little brandy, and he slept under a mosquito net, which he said was much more useful than a revolver. He dosed himself with quinine and the specific that he greatly admired, called Warburg's mixture, and for diarrhea, he resorted to half a grain of ginger, half a grain of ipecacuanha with 3 grains of rhubarb.
Exhausting journeys, the temptation of alcohol to ease distress. Sorely tempted by cognac and laudanum, but dare not think of it, for my liver rules and will not stand it. My temper is very, very short, and it is a bad time for those who come across me. He wrote endless letters at great length to his friends, excused grumbles from a very poor, worn creature at war with all the world, to the Frieses, to his brothers Henry and Enderby, to the Anti-Slavery Society, to the Khedive's chancellor in Cairo, 100 letters a year, all in careful French, and of course to Augusta, mostly about religion. Augusta was not at all interested in Africa.
He tried to look after the sick. It's always my bed, my tent, my etc., that are given up. Within 6 months of 10 Europeans with him, 4 were dead, 2 too ill to work, and of those who did not succumb, he wrote, "They come and go like a dissolving view."
He wrote to Enderby, "I had to sit up all night with my servant who had the fever and who died at 1:30 a.m. Warburg failed in this instance. To Augusta, "I am so angry with the Cairo people. They have no idea of the difficulties up here. However, it is all God's will, so I hope I shall be able to bear it."
One night, a chief with 100 armed men surrounded his tent and walked in on him. Gordon cocked 2 guns, laid them on the table, and said, "Now go." They went.
Yet he still noted all around him with a naturalist's eye, taking delight in the wild beauty of African bird life. Shooting crocodile whenever he could, he thought them horrid, but admiring the charming, if dangerous, hippopotamus.
3 years of frustration, suffering, and anxiety. I am determined to die here or to make some little improvement in the country. Years of some achievement. His predecessor, Sir Samuel Baker, he'd been paid 10,000 a year for the job. Gordon refused to accept more than 2,000. Baker had established 3 up-country stations. Gordon added 13 more and saw to the surveying and the mapping of the Nile right up to the lakes at half an inch to the mile. But for years he'd complained about Baker. I can now say that he had very much to contend with, and I quite whitewash him of any blame. A man now will, DV, with a couple of men, be able to walk in 6 days from Makedi to Gondokoro and sleep every night in safety in my stations. Before this road was open, 100 must have been his escort. This is nice, is it not?
He returned to England, but within weeks he was back again, this time as Governor-General of the whole Sudan. Now he became famous as Gordon the Camel Rider, traveling fast and far across the lonely deserts, resolving disputes, putting down minor rebellions, pacifying the tribes. He frequently outrode his escort as they struggled to match his furious pace. Arriving unexpectedly far ahead of his men in some remote desert settlement, he was a sensation. Sometimes splendid in uniform, sometimes, as he said himself, a dirty red-faced man on a camel ornamented with flies. Surrounded by inquisitive crowds, was it not inevitable that he sometimes felt himself almost a prophet in their midst?
There was at this time another man, a native of Dongola and of the family of the prophet, who in extreme humility before his God contemplated his nothingness in a cave on an island south of Khartoum. His name was Muhammad Ahmed ibn Abdallah, and he was to become the founder of that great movement of religious and national fervor that would sweep through the Sudan like a tide and bear Gordon away with it. But at this moment, he was not a power in the land.
The power was based in Khartoum, and at that time it was Gordon who exercised it. In the governor's palace was his office, to which he hated being bound. As he sat and sweated at his desk, smoking endless cigarettes, rolled and handed to him by a servant, or sat and sweated at endless necessary meetings, which he would terminate with a brusque, uncomprehended, "Now, old bird, it's time for you to go." So his temper shortened, and he longed to be off again at the head of his camel train, riding through the desert. But now he began to be prey to doubts about his own role in the Sudan, about Egypt's and Britain's rights to be doing what they were doing there, and whether Arab governors would not suit the Sudanese people better than any European. "I cannot think," he said, "that any people like being governed by aliens in race and religion." He groped unhappily for reassurance. "I never was, am not, never shall be, and never want to be a great man, but I can say this. I have cut off the slave dealers in their stronghold, and I made all my people love me." It was a touching, ultimately a tragic delusion. Though often clear-minded, he was open to self-delusion. Increasingly doubtful about the policies expected of him, unable honestly to pursue them, he left the Sudan, hoping never to return. Once again, he found himself in footling jobs. He went to India to become, of all things, secretary to the Viceroy. He arrived in Bombay without dress clothes, and after a gala dinner in borrowed kit when he should have been supporting the Viceroy, he was finally run to earth in his own room, legs on the table, smoking. Next morning, he resigned. Then there was a swift excursion to China, scene of his great early exploits, but this time he saw eye to eye with nobody, nothing emerged, and he came back home. At home, in 1881, the magazine Vanity Fair made him the subject of an ape cartoon. The caption ran, "He is set down by officials as being cracky and unsafe to employ, but he's a fine, noble, knightly gentleman, such as is found but once in many generations." The cartoon's subject now volunteered to substitute himself for a friend who didn't want to go to an unimportant military post in Mauritius. Gordon, in Mauritius, escaped from the boredom of the social round, the dreary task,
by discovering the true location of the Garden of Eden. He wrote to a friend, "You will be interested to hear that I can show it is near the Seychelles." And here is his map, showing exactly where he thought it was. Here is Zanzibar, Madagascar, Mauritius, the Seychelles. Here's Gordon's own handwriting saying Garden, and more generally, District of Eden. In fact, he located Eden more particularly to the island of Praslin, because his examination there of the fruit of the coco de mer, or giant palm tree, put him so much in mind of the secret parts of Eve, the first woman, that he unhesitatingly identified that tree as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then he looked at what he describes as the male tree, which put him in mind of Adam's organ, or the first man. Then he compounded this evidence by a further examination of the fruit of the breadfruit tree, which again reminded him of the male organ. So surely this was the tree of life. And also on Praslin, he identified a species of snake, the serpent. It all added up. And Gordon was happily arguing all this with the superintendent of the Royal Botanic Gardens on Pamplemousse, when he was suddenly offered command of the colonial forces of the Cape. So, with loving care, he packed up what he used to call his rubbish, and off he went. The following year, he traveled to the Near East with a Bible in his pocket and a head full of ideas, principal among them a determination to go to Jerusalem and there, to his own satisfaction, to discover the true, not the advertised, places of Christ's crucifixion and the Holy Sepulchre. These are some of his sketches, drawings, and maps done during his search, and letters on the subject, and notes on the sketches. Golgotha on hill near Jeremiah Grotto. 1, this hill is outside gate nigh city, where many roads pass. 2, for long time back, the slaughterhouse of city has been there. And inside, on the first reverse page, there's a sketch map of Jerusalem with the 2 walls, and Golgotha shown as a little beetly hill outside the inner wall. So Gordon did indeed find his own Calvary in more senses than one, but practically speaking, and in Jerusalem, a very plausible site. His Golgotha was a mound shaped very like a skull outside the wall, which now is poised over the East Jerusalem bus station. And near it he found a garden, and in that garden a tomb cut into the rock. Unlike his claim to have found the true site of the Garden of Eden, which was greeted with more than a little skepticism, his claims to have found the real holy places of Jerusalem still have their adherents today. While Gordon was far away resolving the crucial mysteries of Christendom, a revolution of profound significance was taking place in the Sudan, a revolution which spread all the more quickly because there was no one of Gordon's stature to oppose it. The effects of that revolution are very visible in the Sudan 100 years later. These worshippers at the great mosque of Omdurman are Ansar, followers of that same Muhammad Ahmed ibn Abdallah who had once lived in humility in a cave to the south of Khartoum. In 1881, after years of prayer and fasting, he pronounced himself the Mahdi, the expected one, the successor of the prophet of God. The movement he started was religious, but it quickly involved a fervent, unifying nationalism dedicated to the removal of every aspect of Turkish, Egyptian, and British dominance. Just by the great mosque of Omdurman is the Holy of Holies in the Sudan today, the Mahdi's tomb. This cloistered sacred place, more than any other, represents the power that changed the face of the Sudan and brought Gordon back to Khartoum. Yet the Sudanese retain a memory of Gordon. They recognize that he was in his day a formidable figure. And Sudanese historians are inclined to give more weight than our own
the danger of the power vacuum that Gordon's departure in 1879 left in the Sudan, into that vacuum, shrewd, dedicated, passionate, and with brilliant political timing, stepped the Mahdi. The British, as the only major power involved in Africa with the necessary competence, were landed with the problem. Many British, Egyptian, and Turkish, and very many Sudanese lives were to be lost in the long attempt to roll back the mighty army of the Ansar. When Gordon returned from Jerusalem, he found London agog with argument about what action should be taken. He ignored it all. Instead, he rushed off to Brussels, to the royal palace, but he put up in a modest hotel nearby. I don't want the king's servants to see my old comb. He was offered the governor-generalship of the Belgian conquer, which he accepted, and hurried home intent on resigning from the British Army. But onto the scene stepped the influential editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, W.T. Stead, convinced that the one man to sort out the Sudan affair was Major General Charles Gordon. On January the 8th, 1884, Stead went to Southampton to see Gordon, who only the night before had posted his letter of resignation from the British Army in the pillar box down the road. There then followed in this room the first and crucial moments in what was to become a mounting campaign on the part of press and public to send Gordon to Khartoum. Reluctantly at first, Gordon gradually opened his mind and his heart to Stead's questions, and he held the visitors enthralled then for 2 hours with his opinions on the situation and the possibilities in the Sudan. And when he said goodbye, he gave Stead a keepsake, a little pocket edition of St. Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ. This is the article that Stead published next day, January the 9th, in the Pall Mall Gazette. And this is the burden of what he said. If we have not an Egyptian army to employ in the service, if we must not send an English force, what are we to do? There is only one thing we can do. We can send a man who on more than one occasion has proved himself more valuable in similar circumstances than an entire army. Why not send Chinese Gordon with full powers to Khartoum and do what can be done to save what can be saved from the wreck in the Sudan? And on the next page, there followed the Stead-Gordon interview, carrying a direct quote from Gordon, which contains this sentence. If this were done, he said, and the government entrusted to a man whose word was truth, all might yet be re-established. If ever a man wrote his own credentials. The next day, January the 10th, Fleet Street not only reported but republished the Stead-Gordon interview, and the tide began to make. Chinese Gordon for the Sudan became the cry. It was the obvious, it was the noble solution. Even Queen Victoria herself nodded enthusiastic approval from Windsor. Meanwhile, the subject of all this excitement was himself in agony. He was wrestling with the temptation to accept, should the offer actually be made. Like Caesar, he fain would have had the crown, but should he put it by? He went off down to Exeter to stay with some friends who promptly put him in a carriage and took him for a very long ride in the countryside and did everything they possibly could to persuade him to go to Khartoum. And they noticed that his eyes shone. And that night he whispered to one of them, "You saw me today." "You mean in the carriage?" "Yes, you saw me. That was myself, the self that I want to get rid of." The tempter had won. Caesar would accept the crown. The martyr's crown, the crown of glory. He would go. There were now to be seen several key figures in this context who were to play their part in the ensuing drama. In London was the veteran Liberal Prime Minister Gladstone, ineffable, magnificent, and deeply distrustful of the mercurial Gordon. In Cairo was one of Britain's great proconsuls and the real power behind the Khedive's throne, Sir Evelyn Baring. He knew Gordon and felt that he would be disastrous in Khartoum, but although Gordon said of him, "When oil mixes with water, we will mix together," once Gordon was in Khartoum, Baring supported him loyally. Meanwhile at Windsor, following every twist and turn of the story, was the Queen herself. All her instincts made her suspicious of the haughty Gladstone, but she admired Gordon and approved of his being sent to the Sudan. But what was Gordon's role to be? There's no question that he set out on his last mission
without anyone in the government knowing precisely what they or he intended. Neither Gladstone nor Baring really wanted Gordon at all, but they were gradually driven to accept that he would go. But to do what and with what powers? Basically, the government wanted to evacuate the Egyptian garrison from Khartoum. But at one stage, Gordon was to go to Suakin on the Red Sea coast simply to advise and report. Then at a later stage, he was to help in the actual evacuation and to perform such other duties as may be entrusted to him by the Egyptian government. Later still, he was to be Governor General, again, once more based in Khartoum. And the public simply expected a miracle. Gordon was to go to the Sudan, exercise his mesmeric powers, and the Mahdi would give up. As for Gordon, he sailed serenely through all this briefing and counter-briefing, scarcely hearing what was said. As his best and fairest biographer, Charles Chenevert Trench, has written of him, he had a tendency to treat orders as a basis for discussion, to be obeyed if he and a friend above happened to approve. The Lord would provide. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day.
The decision made, no time was wasted over Gordon's departure.
On the 18th of January at Charing Cross Station, Gordon, in buoyant and happy mood, only a few hours after he'd been formally invited to go to Suakim and report on the situation, walked towards the train that was to take him on the first stage of his last journey, the journey that ended in Khartoum. Beside him was his new second-in-command, Colonel J.D. Hannell Stewart, a highly intelligent, very tall, sword of honor out of Sandhurst, much-traveled Anglo-Irishman of the 11th Hussars. The seeing-off party included Gordon's old friend Lord Wolseley, who carried Gordon's small suitcase up the platform. Same Wolseley who later said, "I was never worthy even to pipe-clay his belt." The Duke of Cambridge, who rather admired Gordon, and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Granville. As so often happened with Gordon, there were one or two unusual occurrences at this departure. First, Lord Granville went and booked the tickets. One may be permitted to inquire, perhaps, whether he was able to book right through. And also, in view of the government's attitude in sending Gordon, of all people, to handle this most delicate situation, whether he booked returns or singles. Then it was found that Gordon had come without any money at all. It also transpired that a nephew of his was even at that moment racing towards the station with his uniform, which he'd also left behind. Now, Wolseley had about £300 in gold in a leather case, which one story says he'd collected that very evening from friends in clubs, but which I believe was more likely to have represented the agreed £3 a day allowance which Gordon was to have for a period of 100 days. And he handed that over to Gordon, but in spite of this, he later emptied the contents of his pockets, all the cash, and his gold watch and chain, and gave those to Gordon as well. Gordon, in return, gave him a small crocodile cigarette case. This one. Which still contains 4 cigarettes. Then Gordon made his final adieus. The Royal Duke opened the carriage door, and Stewart and Gordon got in. Suddenly, Gordon popped his head out of the window and whispered something in Wolseley's ear. Then he was gone. The whisper to Wolseley had been a reminder to purchase enough copies of Dr. Clarke's Scripture Promises to provide one for each member of the cabinet the very next morning. Throughout the journey, Gordon bombarded Gladstone and the government with telegrams suggesting new ideas and new solutions. By the time he reached Cairo, the Foreign Secretary in London was already asking, "Are you sure we did not commit a gigantic folly in sending him?" The subject of the question himself headed south. Gordon started up the Nile. The spate of telegrams continued. Now he was talking of setting up a government in Khartoum after the evacuation. Stewart, known to Gordon as his wet nurse, apologized to Cairo for the telegraph flood. And meanwhile, Gordon telegraphed ahead to Khartoum, almost as if he were the expected one. Do not be panic-stricken. We are men, not women. I am coming.
The boat journey over, another 260 miles by camel lay ahead. A certain Colonel Graham, who had come with them this far, now had to return to Cairo. He remembered the parting in his diary. Gordon mounted his camel and said goodbye. He took my umbrella, having lost his own. The desert at that point is covered with a series of volcanic hills. I climbed up the highest of these and through a glass watched Gordon and the small caravan as his camels threaded their way along a sandy valley until he turned the dark side of a hill and I saw him no more.
He wanted to meet the Mahdi, but this bearing had forbidden as being too dangerous, so instead he wrote to him. And with a miraculous misapprehension both of the man and the moment, he sent him a red robe of honor together with a tarbush, the symbol of Egyptian rule. He offered him the Sultanate of Kordofan. Thus he and Gordon would be colleagues and must not quarrel. At Berber, the mudir, the local dignitary, told Gordon it was an excellent letter, then turned to Stuart and said it was pure nonsense.
But when he reached Khartoum, his touch was more sure. Both administration and garrison were delighted and relieved to see him restored to the governor's palace. He addressed them with confidence.
I have no doubt that God will help us and guide us in restoring the present critical position. I could have brought an army with us, but I did not do so because I have perfect confidence in the troops here.
The Ansar was now threatening Khartoum, and Gordon had an immediate task. While it was still possible and true to his original mission, Gordon evacuated 2,000 Egyptians downriver to Cairo. Still, the spate of telegrams flowed from the governor's palace, until on March the 10th, 3 weeks after his arrival, the Mahdi's forces cut the telegraph lines. Khartoum now prepared for siege. This map, made from Gordon's own sketches, shows how the Blue Nile on the right, the White Nile on the left, meet at the northern point of the city to become the Great Nile, flowing north towards the Mediterranean. So to east, west, and north, the city was well protected. To the south, there was only an 8-foot ditch and rampart, fronted by spikes, broken glass, and under Gordon's direction, electrically operated mines, which flooding of the White Nile might render useless. He manned his ramparts, tightened discipline, had sentries flogged who slept at their posts. He was pretty well supplied. Khartoum had a working arsenal, and the garrison, part Sudanese, part Egyptian, were at least trained and uniformed men.
Then there were the steamers. Gordon had 6, and each of them he thought worth 2,000 men. This is one of them, the Bourdain. Famous in history, the carrier of ammunition from Cairo and of the last dispatches down from Khartoum, still here, in essence, in the dockyards of Khartoum. And the dockyards here converted them into gunboats, with timber and iron palisades and turrets, with Krupp breech loaders and machine guns. Each carried 50 or so infantry and artillerymen in addition to the crew, and each, according to Gordon, stank like a badger.
While he had steamers, he could still send and receive dispatches, though he often used native runners who were quicker. But his gunboats were so well deployed and so bravely fought that the rivers remained open until the end. It was the old story. As in China, he was leading native troops, which he hoped and believed would be another ever-victorious army. It was a lonely task, but he did have at this stage stalwart British colleagues at his side. Colonel Stuart was a powerful ally, with good political as well as military sense, and always thoroughly practical in advice and action. And there was the young correspondent of the Times, Frank Power, who pleaded Gordon's case in his dispatches and incidentally thought Gordon the greatest and best man of the century. But Gordon's resources became slenderer as the might of the Mahdi's force grew, recruiting tribe after tribe, inspiring its soldiers with a terrifying fervor, and increasingly well equipped. The bulk of the Ansar now moved massively towards Khartoum. By mid-March, the investment of the city was underway.
Not many days later, there came 3 emissaries from the Mahdi, with the reply to Gordon's letter and his offer of the Sultanate of Kordofan and the
Tarbush. Know that I am the expected Mahdi, the successor of the Apostle of God. Thus I have no need of the Sultanate, nor of the kingdom of Kordofan, nor anywhere else, nor the wealth nor vanity of this world. As to your gift that you have sent us, may God reward you for your goodwill and guide you to the truth. It is returned to you, together with the clothing which we wish for ourselves and our companions who desire the world to come. The Mahdi had sent him a jibba, the patched tunic of his followers, the children of poverty, together with a turban and a rosary. And now Gordon made another of his mistakes. He replied abruptly to the Mahdi, addressing him merely as Sheikh. He refused any further exchange and threw aside the gifts.
The ring round Khartoum closed slowly. To begin with, the Ansar kept its distance, but the predicament was clear. Gordon must either fall with the city or be rescued. He had written, "I feel a conviction I will be caught in Khartoum." Now he was. Baring in Cairo saw the situation and told London, "The question is to get General Gordon and Colonel Stewart away from Khartoum. I do not think we can leave them stranded." The Queen, to one of Gladstone's ministers, "Gordon is in danger. You are bound to try and save him." Gladstone to the Queen, "Her Majesty is begged to understand that Gordon is really the author of his own difficulties." Gladstone, angered by Gordon's constant changes of mind, sent a personal message to Gordon asking him bluntly, "What do you intend to do?" When that message reached him 3 months later, Gordon responded,
You ask me to state cause and intention of staying in Khartoum, knowing government means to abandon Sudan. And in reply, I state I stay in Khartoum because the Arabs have shut me in and will not let us out. I also add that even if the road were open, the people would not let me go unless I gave them some government and took them with me, which I could not do. No one would leave more willingly than I would if it were possible. But he added in a private note to Baring, I am still sanguine. God will give us the issue.
In London, Gladstone, hampered by the dreadful slowness of communications with Khartoum, fought against a rising national clamour to send an expedition to rescue Gordon. "There is no necessity for our intervention. A relief expedition would be a war of conquest against a people struggling, and rightly struggling, to be free." But now the Secretary for War, Lord Hartington, intervened. He saw that Gladstone was confronting an unstoppable tide. Gladstone yielded to Hartington's persuasion and finally ordered the relief expedition to sail. Command was given to Lord Wolseley, Gordon's friend, one of that very party who'd seen him off from Charing Cross just 7 months before. With much euphoria and bravado, but after long prevarications and delays, the relief expedition began its arduous and sluggish journey up the Nile. It was magnificent, it was powerful, but it was very, very slow. Wolseley's task was made no easier by such of Gordon's messages as reached him, which would now say, "Khartoum all right, now the town will fall." It was no help to him that some of the messages were meant to deceive the enemy. Even when the relief force had passed the Nile cataracts, hundreds of miles of burning, enemy-haunted desert lay ahead. Outside Khartoum, the Ansar tightened its grip. The Mahdi thought Gordon's situation hopeless, but he had no desire to see him perish. He wrote him several letters, less of anger than of gentle rebuke. One of these letters is preserved in Omdurman. "From the most obedient servant of God, Mohammed el-Mahdi ibn Abdallah, to the noble man of both Egyptian and British governments, Gordon Pasha. I have several times advised you and warned you, but you have increased your pride and boastfulness and abandoned the right way." He repeatedly offered Gordon generous terms for withdrawal, but Gordon was no longer to be moved.
I shall hold on here as long as I can. He wrote that to Baring in Cairo. And if we get out of this, became a frequent phrase in his communications. And the possibility in his mind of survival seems to have prompted other thoughts of possible reactions at home if they were to succeed. and get out of Khartoum. This is also to Bering. He wrote, "It may be bad taste to say it, but if we get out of this, give Stuart a KCMG and spare me at all costs. You will thus save me the disagreeableness of having to refuse it. I hate these things. If we get out, it is the answer to prayer."
But in September, disaster. While out harrying the enemy, 1,000 of his best troops, the pick of the garrison, were ambushed and his best commander killed. Gordon's response was to send Stuart downriver in an armed steamer, the Abbas, to explain his predicament and speed the relief. The Times man Frank Power went with him. But the steamer went aground in hostile territory. Stuart, Power, and the steamer's crew were first welcomed by a local pro-Mahadist sheikh and then massacred. Now Gordon was really isolated, no close colleagues or compatriots left, unable to speak the language of the people around him, uncertain of their loyalty. While across both rivers and beyond the fragile defense lines, the Ansar waited, gathered strength, prepared for the final blow. By now he was often himself under fire, but he took no concern for his own safety. He inspired, cajoled, encouraged, organized, and with amazing energy poured out his thoughts, doubts, complaints, triumphs, his agonies, into a series of journals, sometimes at the rate of 5,000 words a day. His humor, as well as his bitterness, filled page after page of hurried, often barely readable handwriting, littered with corrections or furious crossings out. Here and there, neatly drawn, are sketch maps, as one might expect of Gordon, the Royal Engineer. But less predictably, there are cartoons, like this one, in which he imagines the hawkish gentlemen of the British press collapsing in panic as they approach a fearsome Mahadist army outside besieged Khartoum. Or this one, in which he imagines himself and his situation discussed in dismissive terms, too dreadful, arrant humbug, by a Foreign Office worthy called Egerton on the left, and on the right, Bering. His temper is often very, very bad. He rages against the world. Everyone is out of step except him. He mocks those who attacked him for not being 100% against slavery. Better, my dear Gordon, far better to have died than have so very far departed from the right path. He muses philosophically. The fact is that if one analyzes it, human glory is composed of 9/10 twaddle, perhaps 99/100 twaddle. He's determined to stick it out in Khartoum. If an emissary or letter comes up here ordering me to go down, I will not obey it, but will stay here and fall with the town and run all risks. The last entry is on December the 14th. Now mark this. If the expeditionary force does not come within 10 days, the town may fall. And I have done my best for the honor of my country. Goodbye. And the postscript. You send me no information, though you have lots of money. CGG. On December the 15th, he sent the Bourdain down the Nile with his last dispatches and the last volume of his journal. There was a touching ceremony on the Khartoum waterfront as he said goodbye to the steamer's captain and crew. The Bourdain, unlike the Abbas, did succeed in breaking out, but the news it brought made little difference to the slow pace of the relief force, which now, as it lumbered towards Khartoum, was further delayed by a series of fierce encounters with the enemy. The Ansar fought with the zeal of holy warriors, assured of salvation if they fell in so great a cause. The toughest battle with the relief force was on the 17th of January at Abu Klea, where 10,000 of the Mahdi's best soldiers clashed with an advance column of Wolseley's army. It was a classic military action in which the vastly outnumbered but well-disciplined British repelled the Mahdists' brave, impetuous charges, inflicting great loss. But casualties were heavy on the British side too. One of Wolseley's best commanders was killed, and the relief force's advance became still more cautious and deliberate. Aware after Abu Klea that the sword of Allah was not proof against the guns of the infidel, the Mahdi decided that the time had come to end the siege and take Khartoum. For Gordon, watching with decreasing hope for any signs of the approaching British, time was running out. Who was to blame for the catastrophe that now seemed inevitable? Wolseley, who advanced so slowly? Gladstone, who delayed so long? The public, who expected so much, or Gordon himself. He it was who had decided to remain in Khartoum, whatever the odds. Yet what else could he have done? He'd said he could never save himself and leave Khartoum to its fate. Now he had no choice but to stay, and if need be, accept unflinchingly his personal Calvary.
On January the 25th, Gordon is said to have given up hope and to have said to those around him, "Now leave me alone to smoke these cigarettes." About midnight he slept, exhausted. He may have wished that he did not have to drink this cup, but by now he must have been quite certain that it would not pass from him.
What were his thoughts in those last hours? Anger at being let down? Disillusion at unanswered prayers? Or did he achieve a serenity, an acceptance that death, not deliverance, was the will of God? Before dawn, the Ansar stormed the south ramparts where the mud of the flooding Nile had filled the ditch. Gordon heard the din of battle, dressed, and took his sword and revolver.
There are different accounts of his death. He was on an upper balcony or landing at the head of some stairs, and there he was hit, whether by spear or bullet. Either he stood silent and still, or he said to an assailant, "Strike hard," or he fought against his attackers with sword and revolver until he was hit. He fell on the stairs. One of the Mahdi's soldiers said, "Who is this?" Another one replied, "This is Gordon." "How do you know?" "I knew him in Kordofan. He used to shave his chin and leave whiskers on his cheeks." So they cut off his head in the early morning and took it to the Mahdi not 2 hours after the start of the attack. The Mahdi said, "What is this?" He was answered, "It is the head of Gordon." The Mahdi's eyes darkened. He said, "What deeds are these? Why do you disobey me? Why have you mutilated him? What use is it?"
Two days later, on Gordon's birthday, the first two steamers of the relief force came in sight of Khartoum and saw no flag flying from the palace flagstaff. Gordon was no longer there. For himself, did he perhaps fall, like Nelson, at the right hour? "I am not the rescued lamb," he'd said, "and will not be." Could he have endured deliverance or the slow defeat of age? To everything in his life, he went impulsive. So he did into the desert, faced the last enemy, and was gone.